What if I told you the most dazzling king in European history, the man who built Versailles and ruled like a god, ended his life as a rotting, toothless mass of flesh no one could bear to stand near? This is the hidden truth behind Louis XIV of France. The man they called the Sun King was not just a ruler. He was the most physically perfect monarch Europe had ever seen. Standing at 5'9" with a chiseled frame, glowing skin, and pitch-black curls that fell like silk, Louis was magnetic. He could dance ballet for 6 hours without breaking a sweat. When he passed by, foreign diplomats literally forgot how to speak. But here's the part the history books never mention. That same golden god of Versailles would end up a swollen, 100-kilogram wreck decaying alive from gangrene. His breath reeked so terribly that even perfumed court masks could not hide it. The stench made foreign envoys vomit in the middle of royal meetings. I have medical records, real hidden documents, that trace this terrifying transformation, secrets French historians have tried to bury for over 4 centuries. So if you're ready to discover what really happened inside the golden walls of Versailles, read on, because what I'm about to share will change everything you thought you knew about European royalty. Picture it: a marble staircase gleaming under golden light. A 23-year-old king descends, draped in a ceremonial robe embroidered with pure gold thread. It weighs 15 kilograms, but he carries it like feathers. 5,000 nobles hold their breath as Louis XIV, every inch a living statue, walks past a corridor of Venetian mirrors. The reflections multiply his presence, making him seem like a divine force. Sunlight floods in through crystal windows, painting his already glowing skin in an angelic shimmer. His voice, deep and commanding, carries clearly across the entire hall. Court members said his sapphire blue eyes felt like falling stars piercing your very soul. His stride was so powerful that the wooden floors of Versailles shook with each step. And then there was the scent, not of perfume, but of something primal, masculine, and magnetic. Even hardened noblemen found themselves dazed when he walked by. But Louis was not just a pretty face with royal blood. He was something far more dangerous. Fluent in 5 languages, French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German, Louis XIV was a prodigy. By age 20, he could outduel his Italian sword masters, men considered the finest in all of Europe. He was not just strong, he was tireless. He could perform an entire ballet and then compose a poem that made hardened diplomats cry. British Ambassador Nathaniel Cold once wept openly after hearing one of Louis's verses recited in court. Louis's stamina was unmatched. Official records show he consumed 4 full meals and 3 snacks a day, yet kept a muscular, athletic physique. He would hunt wild boars in the forests around Versailles for 8 hours straight and then dance until 3 a.m. Not once did he complain of fatigue. His memory bordered on supernatural. Louis XIV could recall the names and faces of over 3,000 courtiers, along with details about their families, ambitions, and even mistresses. And speaking of mistresses, his legendary appetite was not limited to food. Confidential court notes say he maintained intimate relationships with at least 12 different women every month. Foreign envoys were spellbound. One Venetian diplomat called his charisma otherworldly. When Louis entered a room, conversations died, pulses quickened, and even his enemies were left speechless. This was the golden age of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV was its gleaming centerpiece. Each morning, more than 100 nobles fought for the honor of handing Louis his silk shirt. They competed to hold his mirror, pour his water, or tie his laces. Even bedtime was a spectacle. Full-grown men battled for the right to snuff out his candle at night. Versailles itself was never just a palace. It was a carefully orchestrated stage for a divine performance. 10,000 courtiers lived within its walls, their every gesture scripted to elevate the king's image. When Louis strolled through the Hall of Mirrors, the endless reflections created the illusion of a god moving through time itself. Even the marble under his feet was imported from Italy at astronomical cost, so that each step he took echoed with imperial dominance. But even in these shimmering years, subtle signs of decay were beginning to show. In 1987, a sealed set of documents from Louis's court physician was finally decoded. They reveal unsettling truths that everyone around the king chose to ignore. By the time he was 20, Louis needed 2 to 3 enemas a day just to relieve himself. His chronic constipation was caused by eating 6 to 8 times daily, an excessive intake that no body, royal or not, was built to endure. There were other red flags. His breath was so putrid he constantly popped mint lozenges to hide the stench. His skin, oily and scarred from acne, was caked in layers of white powder and rouge. His digestion was a daily disaster that required constant medical attention, but none of this reached the public. A fortress of court rituals ensured that weakness looked like ritual, and medical intervention looked like divine tradition. Yet perhaps the most damning detail was this. Louis XIV refused to bathe. Every day he only washed his hands and face. That was it. His body was scrubbed maybe twice in his entire life. This was not laziness. It was belief. In those days, many thought water weakened the body or opened it to evil spirits. Louis was convinced that his natural body odor was a sign of masculine power and divine favor. That one decision, to treat water like the plague, would be the spark that lit the fire of his downfall. In January 1686, something began to fester in the darkest, dampest corners of his body, something terrifying. That's where the nightmare truly begins. On January 15, 1686, Louis XIV, now 47 years old, the radiant Sun King and once the living symbol of perfection, began to feel discomfort. It was not agony, not even pain, just a slight unease when sitting down. But it was enough to summon his personal physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, a man whose treatments had already claimed more lives than the plague. Dr. Fagan examined the king and declared the issue to be simple: hemorrhoids. It was not hemorrhoids. This moment would mark the beginning of a 30-year spiral into horror, pain, and humiliation, a nightmare that would slowly consume the most powerful man in Europe from the inside out. Within a week, that minor discomfort became a stabbing pain, like a burning dagger lodged near his spine. By January 22nd, a swelling the size of a walnut had formed. 6 days later, it began to bleed constantly. Louis was now forced to sit on soft cushions during official meetings. By February 5th, the palace staff noticed a new, unfamiliar odor clinging to the king's robes, sharp and putrid. By February 12th, an external abscess had formed beside the rectum, oozing pus and feces around the clock. Imagine the worst infection you have ever heard of. Now multiply that by 100. That was now the reality of Louis XIV's body. The smell was so bad that diplomats requested early dismissals from court. Some even vomited in their chairs. Versailles, once the embodiment of glory, was beginning to reek of rot. Dr. Fagan's response was medieval torture disguised as treatment. He began by ordering multiple enemas every single day, cold water, sometimes infused with herbs. Over the course of 6 months, Louis endured more than 2,000 enemas as Fagan desperately tried to cleanse the royal intestines. When that failed, they turned to hot irons. Metal rods were heated until glowing red and then applied directly to the infected area. The king was pinned down by his own courtiers while he screamed, screams that echoed 3 stories down into the halls of Versailles. Still, the infection grew. So they began daily bloodletting, removing over half a liter of blood from the king's body every day to balance the humors. Instead of healing, Louis weakened, his body crying out under the weight of agony and delusion. Then came the potions. Quack doctors from across France arrived with grotesque remedies: bull semen mixed with wine, crushed pearls dissolved in cow's blood, frog fat infused into brandy, each one more bizarre and foul than the last. Yet Louis, desperate to retain his image as divine, endured them all. By November 1686, the palace could no longer hide the horror. The odor alone had become a diplomatic crisis. Something had to be done. That's when the king's life was handed over to a man who had never performed this kind of surgery before. Enter Charles-François Félix, the king's personal barber turned surgeon. He was now tasked with something utterly unthinkable: operate on the most powerful monarch in Europe's infected rectal fistula, with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no room for failure. If he succeeded, he would be a legend. If he failed, he would be executed. So Felix began to prepare. For weeks, he practiced his technique on 75 prisoners and volunteers, operating on live, conscious men with makeshift tools, refining a single, precise motion. He even designed a custom silver scalpel, curved specifically to navigate the most intimate corridors of the king's body. Then came the day that would change history. At 6 a.m., under cover of secrecy, the surgery began inside the king's private chambers. There was no anesthesia, just 4 loyal nobles to hold Louis down and a thick piece of wood for him to bite when the pain became unbearable. For the next 3 hours, the palace heard the unfiltered, guttural screams of a man being cut open from within. Felix sliced through the infected flesh, carving along the fistula canal. When the scalpel reached the deepest part of the abscess, a blast of pus and rot exploded from the wound. 2 assistants vomited on the spot and fled the room. Blood soaked the sheets. Louis's teeth cracked the wooden gag. When the blade touched his tailbone, he shrieked a single word. Mon Dieu! It was his first audible cry of helpless pain in years. The hidden surgical notes, only discovered in 2007, describe over 200 milliliters of blue-green pus, the smell like a battlefield corpse left in the sun. Bits of tissue flaked off, revealing bone blackened by necrosis. The nightmare was far from over. Though the surgery ended at 9:15 a.m., the wound would not heal. The infection had burrowed too deep, and the damage was too severe. One operation became 4. December 6th, the second surgery. December 8th, the third surgery. December 10th, the final, most brutal procedure. The final surgery lasted 6 hours while 6 men held the king down as Felix carved away dead flesh with blades and forceps. Altogether, they removed so much decayed tissue it could fill a wine goblet. Louis XIV endured 15 hours of surgery over 3 weeks, awake, screaming, bleeding. But even after all that, the wound continued to fester. The king now lived with a permanent anal fistula. Pus and feces leaked from his body every single day for the rest of his life. He had to wear absorbent pads beneath his robes, and his scent, once described as magnetic, now resembled death itself. In a desperate bid to mask the smell, Louis XIV launched what would become the most expensive perfume campaign in human history. He spent the modern equivalent of $2 million per year on scents: Bulgarian rose, Arabian amber, Indian sandalwood, imported from every corner of the known world. Versailles was transformed into a scent machine. Fresh flowers were replaced every 2 hours. Scented smoke was pumped into every chamber. Perfumed cloths were laid on every chair the king might sit on. Even his food was soaked in aromatic oils. But all the perfumes in the world could not erase the truth. Under the silks and satin, under the divine rituals and ceremonies, Louis XIV was now a rotting monument to human decay, and his body had only just begun to fall apart. By the early 1690s, the once glorious body of Louis XIV had turned into something unrecognizable. His weight had ballooned from 77 kilograms in his prime to over 140 kilograms. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times just to support his growing size. He could no longer mount a horse without the help of 6 strong men. Artists at court were ordered to paint him only from specific, flattering angles. But visiting dignitaries were not fooled. One Russian ambassador sneered that the French king smelled worse than his horse and waddled like a pregnant cow. Then came the dental disaster of 1693. His doctors, convinced that all sickness came from the mouth, decided to pull every single tooth in one brutal session. No anesthesia, no surgical precision, just iron tools and cruelty. What followed was a butchery. The extraction shattered Louis's upper jaw and fractured the lower. A hole formed between his mouth and nasal cavity, causing wine and food to shoot out of his nose whenever he ate. His speech became slurred and almost incomprehensible. Courtiers had to lean into his foul breath just to understand his royal commands. From his now toothless mouth, saliva constantly dripped. Combined with his leaking fistula and extreme obesity, Louis XIV had transformed into a slobbering, gasping, reeking parody of the divine monarch he once claimed to be. Yet somehow the show went on. Versailles responded with its usual tool, rituals and masks. More than 200 new court protocols were invented, not to honor the king, but to hide him. A color-coded ribbon system was introduced. Red ribbons meant avoid the king. He's in pain. White ribbons meant approach only with scented masks. Black ribbons meant do not enter. His condition is catastrophic. The famed 2-hour morning ritual was slashed to 30 minutes to limit exposure to his scent. The nighttime ceremony was altered to allow servants to discreetly insert absorbent cloths into his undergarments to manage the never-ending discharge from his fistula. Thick curtains were arranged to conceal the changing of his soiled linens. Even the windows of Versailles were opened on a precise schedule to direct the foul air away from visitors. Every hour, 500 fresh flowers were delivered, and 50 scent machines ran non-stop to drown out the stench of rot. The courtiers adapted. Each noble was required to carry a pomander, a decorative orb filled with spices and perfumes, to hold under their nose during royal encounters. Some guests even began breathing through perfumed rags. Ladies of the court routinely excused themselves mid-ceremony to vomit in private, but they never admitted the real reason. Instead, they blamed fainting spells or female discomfort. Even diplomacy began to suffer. The English ambassador requested that meetings with the king be held outdoors, citing health issues. The Spanish envoy started sending junior diplomats in his place. Whispers spread across Europe. Could the Sun King really rule if he could not? Even control his own bowels? Yet Louis XIV still clung to absolute power. The worse his body failed, the more fiercely he performed the divine role. Every ritual, every meeting, every decree became a mask to shield the world from the truth. Their God-King was dying. On August 11, 1715, at 4:30 a.m., Louis XIV screamed. The sound tore through the silence of Versailles. His left leg felt like it was on fire. Dr. Fagan, now 72 and nearly blind, declared it sciatica. He was wrong. By August 15th, black spots had appeared on the king's big toe. By August 18th, the skin burned to the touch. By August 22nd, a new smell had invaded the palace. Not pus, not feces, but the stench of rotting flesh. Dry gangrene had taken hold. Modern doctors now confirm it was an advanced necrotic condition, a deadly mix of poor circulation and untreated infection. No one dared suggest amputation. Who would dare cut off the leg of a man who claimed divine appointment by God himself? By August 25th, the blackened tissue had spread halfway up his leg. His courtiers began to faint upon entering his chamber. The smell now filled 3 entire floors of Versailles. On August 28th, during a routine change of socks, the king's toe fell off. It just dropped to the floor. A courtier fainted at the sight of the exposed white bone jutting from a sea of blackened, sloughing skin. By August 30th, gangrene had consumed his shin. His flesh, now disintegrating in chunks, seeped fluids that no medicine could stop. The Sun King had become a living corpse. Yet, somehow, he ruled. Even as his body rotted, Louis XIV signed decrees with a trembling hand. He issued military orders with a rasping voice while infection crept toward his throat. A Venetian ambassador wrote, "The French king dies before our very eyes." An Austrian representative called it the most grotesque sight ever witnessed. Still, courtiers entered. Still, they bowed, but now they wore scented masks. Linens were changed every 2 hours. A team of 20 servants worked in shifts just to manage the fluids leaking from his body. Some begged for reassignment, others simply left in horror. Even from the palace gardens, visitors could smell the king. Doctors and diplomats traveled from across Europe, not to help, but to witness this unprecedented royal death in real time. They wrote letters and official reports detailing every stage of Louis's living decomposition. By September 1st, the infection reached his throat muscles. He could barely speak. Summoning his great-grandson, the boy who would one day become Louis XV, he whispered one final warning. "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." His voice sounded like sandpaper over rust. They were among his last coherent words. At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was finally gone. But the horror did not end. Within hours, the gangrene returned with vengeance. His abdomen began to bloat from the gases of decomposition. His skin turned black. His throat, already half decayed, began to ooze. Doctors rushed to perform an autopsy just 6 hours after death. Any longer, and the body would have been too decomposed to examine. The findings were staggering. His entire left side was gangrenous, his throat muscles were liquefied, his intestines were swollen to twice their normal size, and a parasitic worm half a meter long was found in his colon. The embalmers could not preserve the corpse. Even working in perfumed cloth masks, several of them vomited and fled. The decay was too rapid, the stench unbearable. The coffin had to be sealed immediately, reinforced with lead, and buried quickly. During the funeral, attendees could hear strange popping and gurgling sounds as the king's body, now a bag of gas and fluid, continued to fall apart. But the illusion had to remain. The French court announced a peaceful passing after a brief illness. They burned Dr. Fagan's medical records, hid Felix's surgical notes for 300 years, and buried the autopsy in secret archives. All evidence that the divine Sun King died as a putrid, grotesque heap of human decay was hidden from the public. Louis XIV ruled for 72 years, the longest in European history. He built the most magnificent palace in the world, demanded absolute obedience, and declared himself appointed by God. But in the end, he died more miserably than a starving peasant. His divine body rotted while his mind remained trapped inside, fully aware of the horror. The man who claimed he was the state, who made nobles fight to tie his shoes and be kissed by thousands, ended up alone, foul, and slowly falling apart. No perfume could hide it. No ritual could disguise it. No title could stop it. His death was the final, grotesque proof. Even kings cannot escape the truth of flesh, rot, and mortality. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next investigation.